ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrea Rumpf. I'm director of LUCA, Luxembourg Center for Architecture, in the name of LUCA and our partner, the Master in Architecture of Luxembourg University. I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's lecture. This is LUCA lecture number 196, and it's the second lecture in our new cycle that we set up together with the Master in Architecture, and which is called This Will Fit That, and that focuses on architecture's impact on urban tissues, on urban development, but also on all the aspects that architecture can activate, which go beyond the object itself. So tonight's story will be about two visionary Belgian architects. René Heyvaert, who constructed the house in the late 50s on his quest to offer affordable housing for everyone, and experiments a lot while building this house, hoping to bring it to a maturity where it could be reproduced in an industrial scheme. And in the same house, 60 years later, we meet Peter Swinnen on his quest not only to restore this fragile and delicate building, but to reactivate it. Not only to repair its body, but to reanimate its very soul. But before listening to what happens to René and Peter in this house, let's learn more about Peter Swinnen from someone who was first his student, then his staff member, and finally colleague and I suppose friend, Philipp Natter.
Peter Swinnen, born 1972 in Brussels, studied architecture at St. Lucas in Brussels, where he graduated in 1995, after which he completed a postgrad at the AA Architectural Association in London in 1997. From 1995 to 1996, he collaborated with Luc Deleu at Top Office in Antwerp, and in 1997 he co-founded the Office 51 N4E in Brussels. Key projects are, amongst others, on an anecdotal note, a proposal for the requalification of the urban garden in Esch in 2000, and on more substantial projects, the reconversion of the Groningen Museum in Bruges, completed in 2002, La Motte Center for Urban Culture in Mechelen, completed in 2005, Art Economy, a seminal house reconversion, completed in 2009, for which he conceived the book Reasons for Walling a House, which received, amongst others, the Dam Architectural Book Award in 2012. Seamine, the reconversion of a mining site in Genk, completed in 2011. TID Tower, a multi-purpose high-rise, and Skanderbeg Square, the central square, both in Tirana, Albania, completed in 2014. From 2004 to 2008, Peter Swinnen taught at La Cambre in Brussels. And in 2010, he was appointed the third Vlaamse Bouwmeester, a 5-year mandate which he started with the publication of 7 memos for an enlightened building culture. In 2015, he became researcher and PhD candidate at the KU Leuven, led an architecture and policy studio at the AA in London, and launched his new office, Crit Architects, in Tervuren. From 2016 to 2018, he was guest professor at the ETH in Zurich and is currently visiting professor at the University of Luxembourg. So far for some of the facts. Some, because even though this selective resume already amounts to an impressive body of work, it doesn't portray the diversity, the intensity, and above all, the complexity of Peter Swinnen's professional life. So, how can you introduce an architect entitling his lecture A Belgian House, when this same architect, at the tender age of 33, proposed to altogether forget about Belgium, and at 36, proposed a total redesign in 10 steps of the Belgian territory, turning Brussels into a city-state, and announcing, amongst others, a potential new chance for Luxembourg. It's somewhere down here, it's 0.8, I think. How can you introduce an architect that you know for 15 years? And as Andrea said, who was your teacher, your employer, and has become your mentor, colleague, and friend. And how can I, Peter, as you suggested, keep your introduction short and direct when there's actually nothing short and direct about you or your career? Over the years, I came to acknowledge Peter's passionate interest for polemic historical figures. For the exiled Curcio Malaparte, the diplomat, the writer, the film producer, the polemicist, and architectural client or even architect. The first shunned, then rehabilitated Fernand Pouillant, the architect, writer, and entrepreneur. The architect failing his invest, Willy van der Meren, and maybe now and today on a similar note, René Heyvaert, the architect turned artist. Similar to Peter Swinnen, none of these figures have a conventional professional record. But what they probably all share is a radical pursuit of their passions, a sharpened and pioneering sensitivity, and an unconditional, and I have to say fearless will for cultural production and controversial debate and confrontation. The Luxembourg Center for Architecture, please give a warm welcome to Peter Swinnen, writer, curator, designer, and space producer.
Thank you, Philip, for the more than generous introduction. It's always strange to see your 25 years passing by in 3 minutes, but okay. Very much appreciated. Also, for the LUCA, Andrea, University of Luxembourg, Florian, thank you for the trust and also the chance of talking tonight. In the series, This Will Feed That. A series which is dealing each time per lecture with one project, which is of course a constraint, especially for architects, to talk about only one project. But at the same time, it could allow us to deepen maybe certain insights, which very often I think in the architectural discipline, we forget to deepen certain insights. And This Will Feed That. It's a title actually also aiming at the fact that maybe we should less be interested in, let's say, the absolute architecture, the architectural object, as Andrea pointed out in the introduction, but maybe see architecture as a liaison, as a next step to something else, so to see architecture beyond itself. And maybe I should add that I'm mainly interested also in all the projects that you saw in the introduction by Philip. In a way, I'm mainly interested in the butterfly effect of those projects. And of course, that's something you can't control. It's beyond your control. At the same time, I do believe that each of those projects, even the most private one, a private house, can have an effective butterfly effect. So tonight I'm going to show you a project which is a project by somebody else, René Heyvaert. The title is effectively called A Belgian House, because I do believe not only in the architectural rendering of the project, the architectural process of the whole project. This is a truly Belgian, uncompromising, almost shameless project, which I truly adore. The architect is René Heyvaert. And presumably you don't know René Heyvaert, which is of course a shame. Hence this lecture, to get you first acquaintance with the figure. René Heyvaert probably disappeared also as an architect, but also as an artist, because he spent 15 years as an architect and 15 years of his life as an artist. He died quite young. René Heyvaert disappeared from the radar quite quickly, disappeared into the cracks of recent history. So hopefully tonight, at least we can show some of the intelligence of Heyvaert. And we'll do this, of course, through this house. On the right, you see the house as it was delivered in 1958. On the left, you see the intervention. So we had the chance in 2016-17 to also there get the trust to work on the house in a very punctual manner. Making the house into a kind of cadavresque, because what you will see during the lecture is that the house in the last 60 years has been rewritten at least 3-4 times, because it's a family house, and a family grows, it shrinks, it changes, somebody leaves, dies. And in that sense, it's a very, like I said, uncompromising project. Which, if I go back also, I mean, I called it a Belgian house because, of course, there's a big interest also in what's called so-called Belgian architecture. Although I wouldn't know what Belgian architecture is, and in that sense, I still stick to my "forget Belgium" quote. But this project, I think, does bear some DNA, interesting DNA, if you would link it back to today and some of the fascinations, even obsessions of architects today, Belgian architects. So this house, in a way, is a kind of interesting, exemplary project. And of course, as architects, we're also interested in the things that go beyond the architecture. So I'll briefly dwell as well on different roles that we took on the last 3 years. Making the book, making the film. I show you a brief fragment also of this film. Making the exhibition. So from architects, started as an architectural intervention, architectural reinterpretation of the house. We became curator, editor, producer of the film. And even the last, I think 3 weeks ago, we got the question almost to become the broker of the house, in the sense that the family is going to sell it, and asked us to guide them in order to make sure that the house actually goes to the right people. As always, a project starts, I think, as in a rather haphazard manner. And so this is spring 2015. The person you see is Christian Keretz, who was in Brussels at the time presenting a big-time competition. And he had some time to spare, so he asked me, so could we drive around? Could we have a look, talk in the car, see maybe some projects? So this is what we did. And during this very nice drive, I don't think we saw a lot of projects, but in some way, in some strange way, we arrived at the Heyvaert House, which back then, to be honest, I didn't know that well. I didn't know Heyvaert that well. It was a kind of lingering intuition, a lingering fascination. Never been there. So good luck, we drove up the driveway, hoping that the people would be at home. And of course, the owners by now are 90 years old, 9-0, so they were at home. And also the daughter was at home, Lieve Heyvaert, who received us in the most generous way. Open arms, as if we were part of the family. We were, in the same moment, introduced to part of the archive, which was at the house, and started to understand that this maybe slightly quirky construction had numerous reasons behind it, why it was like this. This is again from the 50s, and as you can see, I hope the resolution is good enough that you can see also at the back. As you can see, the house is built with minimum means, it's pure economy of means, but in a very radical manner. It's built with very cheap material. Back then it was not done. By now I think it's completely accepted, even embellished and seen as an aesthetic choice. I think here it was not truly an aesthetic choice. There was hardly any budget. The house had to be built over the time of a summer period. And even, so this is the back of the house, or used to be the back of the house. And you see this strange volume peeking out, the staircase. You can't design such a thing, I think, or I hope, actually. It's a kind of succession of decisions, and most of the decisions, and in that sense, decisions taken on site. So the project was drawn to a certain extent, got a building permit, but the main decisions were actually taken on site. And so during this visit with Christian at the house, in a very natural way, the family, who had solicited already numerous architects, who each time failed to answer them, said, well, could we please have a first kind of exchange on the subject of the afterlife of this house, because the original owners are 90 years old. Actually, back then, the construction was not crumbling, but it was going to crumble. So something had to be done. So either you had to tear it down, either you had to sustain it. And to be honest, 2015 for me was also, in that sense, maybe an interesting period because I just finished my first life, I think, at the office, 51 and Farif, after 16 years of practice, leaving it because I think for me the model was no longer something that could be sustained. And I just had also 5 years of Baumeister, so public practice. And then the question was what to do next. So the afterlife also applied to myself. So what could you conceive as in your, let's say, professional development as an architect as being a next step? I didn't have any answers, but this project, in a way, this very subtle, minor or minute project helped us to take next steps. So very quickly we became friends with the family. We were invited numerous times. This is a couple of weeks later with the family and friends. My wife still pregnant at the foreground. And in a very, as it should be, I think, in a very natural way, it went into a commission, started to think about, not only think, but also act, so that this house actually could be saved. And at the same moment, there was also a residency organized at the house where you were, let's say there was no budget, but you were promised each time a month of residency at the house so you could do whatever you want. So you had people, maybe like Patrick van Kakenberg, who is a Belgian artist. De Velder Vinctailleux was also a month residency, Philippe Dujardin. So, and each time, each month, you could invite people. There were the very, very informal meetings and discussions on the house. So we used this residency to understand where this impossible house comes from. And I think a very interesting link, I hope it's clear enough on the screen, is the Le Corbusier's Maison à Sec, so kind of purely 100% prefab housing project that he developed in 1940, which was never built, but shows a remarkable resemblance to the Heyvaert House, being a raised house, so on stilts, a house with an exterior access, a house also, can you see this? With one central heating system. I mean, the Heyvaert House has one central heating system, which is logical, seeing the economy of means, and let's say poor materials. Another example, Philip also showed it in its introduction, by another, I think, prolific architect who is virtually unknown, Willy van der Meeren. If you don't know him, do check it out. Willy van der Meeren was a true socialist architect who wanted to build for the masses, very cheap. So this model, which by now is also very dear to us because it's the house we live in, one of the houses, and we work in the other house, so we have two of those. Built in 10 days' time, built for, back then, 4,000 euros. Everything is completely recyclable, and everything is prefab, except, of course, for the brickwork. And this attitude, this is a house from 1954. The Heyvaert House is 1958. Heyvaert, although we don't have full proof, he was aware of this architecture. Or maybe another, so it's a small trip towards unknown Belgian architects, Peter Callebaut, which probably is also not very known, who built this house. He usually built in a very beautiful, precise manner with wooden constructions. So a full base and a very light wooden construction with upper windows, which you could also see at the Heyvaert House. This is 1956. And then even a decade earlier, of course, case study housing, Eames House. And if you see the structure of the Eames House and, you see the structure of the Heyvaert House, I don't think there are strangers. But nevertheless, to me, I think the Heyvaert House in a way goes even a step further. It's a self-built house. mainly because there was no budget to pay a contractor. And so on site, the things were bricolaged. So it's not a glorification of bricolage, it's not an aestheticization of bricolage, it was a pure necessity to build a thing yourself. And as you can see, the house sits on a terrain on stilts because it's flooding area, so normally you shouldn't build there. But nevertheless, the terrain was extremely cheap. I think it was like 700 euros if you would... So why not build there? Maybe if you can make sure that the water actually can go under the house. And all the material that you see, the sections are extremely minimum. Even when we did the residency and we invited people, we could have maximum 10 people per session on the first floor. Otherwise, the whole thing started to do this. But that's an interesting minimum as well, you know, a kind of limitation, because you can't have it all. So if you go like purely economical, maybe these are also consequences you have to face. And also interesting, I think, as an example today, this house, which is more or less net 65 square meters, which had to house 5 to 6 people. So 2 parents, initially 2 children, then 3 children, 4 children. And as you can see here, this is the plan which was handed in for the building construction, which is still, I think, not a very clear plan. You still see on the left the stair inside the house, so part of the... And you see in all its dimensions that this house is too small. It's kind of... other parts of the building permission dossier. And I think it's interesting, you can't read it, but here it's mentioned white corrugated polyester. So this is white. These are Ytong bricks, which back then were not very used that often. Even he installed curtains because people were afraid with this kind of glass that you would be too close to your neighbor. But also, I think this is a very beautiful drawing, imagining red finishing for the roof, which never happened. The blue curtains, which never happened. And you see here some kind of access, which never happened. The plan in the end was dumbed down to this kind of basic scheme. So you have a central core for showering, toilets, a kitchen in front, and then you have a couple of niches, not even rooms, but niches. And they were living a lot outside, so in that sense, a small square meter is in that sense kind of feasible option. But it also shows that, I mean, also today when we talk about living in a more compact manner, where we mainly also look at maybe one single or one person families, I think you can also do this when the family is much bigger. And of course, as the project evolved, and as also the dikes were strengthened, so the river which is nearby didn't flood anymore, or not that often. So they started to use the ground floor level, almost with elements. I think it's a kind of, I mean, the collage goes on and on. So things which, at least aesthetically, are not conceived as something, as an ensemble. A garage door. Even here in a letter by Heyvaert to his brother, and this was at an interesting moment. Heyvaert, after the construction of the house, he went to America, trying to make sure that the house could actually be mass-produced, which never happened. But it also shows that he was dreaming, let's say, similar to Willy van der Meeren, to have a kind of mass production of very simple techniques for housing. But it still takes some other type of attitude in order to actually make it happen. And here in the letter, this is of course in Dutch, or a certain type of Dutch, you see, for instance, a suggestion for a balcony, an outside balcony, which all of a sudden starts to compete with the stair. So he's perennially searching, looking for alternatives, changing the house, so the house could never reach a final state. And I think that's a very important thing also within architecture, I mean, the kind of fetishization of the final ultimate state, I mean, here, in a way, it's not even an option. On the inside, and that's also quite interesting, in order to cut costs, chipboard was used, but you have to know, chipboard back then, it was unknown. I mean, it didn't exist in Belgium, so it was shipped by transported by train to Belgium, and started to work with 122 by 244 measurements with windows on top. And you can see, let's say, the whole house finding its structure through the material, uncut, untreated, and maybe going back then chipboard was more glue than wood in a way. So it's not the chipboard that we know today. And so this summer of 58, construction started and was completed. Rather adventurous, I think. And during this residency, going back to the year 2015, this was a kind of very first draft of a proposal, because what to do with the house when probably the family would leave. Also the daughter was hinting at the fact maybe it should become a residency, full stop. So this was actually a proposal to double everything, so to make sure that at all time 2 people could stay at the house. So it became a kind of Rorschach, knowing that the house already, if you would cut it here in the middle, almost is a kind of mirrored plan. Pushing it a bit further, we proposed 12 interventions, of which I think 7 happened, going from extra sliding doors. So again, adding things, so not just restoring the house as it was, but starting to work with it, with the logic it had, an invisible door, curtains, which we did with the Chevalier Masson, testing it in a model, but also trying to bring back certain extremely intelligent yet simple principles. Like, for instance, this railing for the balustrade, which by Heyvaert, so it's just a standard tube. You just smash both sides and you just fix it, and then you have a balustrade. So these things were reused. Then the house got stripped because it was completely rotten. I mean, the whole material, I mean, the chipboard from the 1950s was, I mean, it was still there, but at the same time, you couldn't use it anymore. Which for a long time we tried not to do, but at the same time, I mean, the house is not a museum, so, and then you start to see, let's say, this is like the clean structure, where you still see parts of the boards, the original boards. And then very slowly we move into, and I'm going to show you a couple of images, and these are, of course, architectural images. So I can assure you, by now, the house doesn't even look anymore like the pictures I'm going to show you, because that's the interesting part. You see 2 floors. So by 2015, the ground floor was completely occupied. The ground floor, I can't stand up at the ground floor, so the ground floor is more or less 185. But nevertheless, seeing the family was old by now, the stairs became difficult. They were living on the ground floor. So we mainly focused on this first floor, piano nobile space. And the beautiful thing is that once the construction site was finished, the owners actually decided to move back again to the first floor, which in a way I think was a compliment. But then again, they started to change things. So here you see the entrance, or how we imagined the entrance. One of the first rooms with the sliding doors, which are covered in riet, natural material. One of the living rooms. The view outside from the living room. Not living room, bedrooms. All these things in a way are updated, but also altered. So for instance, this structure was non-existing, was added. again, this moment between one part of the house, the other part of the house. And the kitchen. And I'm going to show you a small part of a movie. So I mentioned that one of the roles that we took on was also, let's say, director and producer of a movie, which was put out last year. You will see, I mean, I'll be in the movie as well. Jan de Velder is also in the movie, so it's a kind of...
Wanneer is keer naar boven gaan, hè? Is het goed dat we de eerste keer naar boven gaan? Hè? Oh ja, je moet me excuseren, maar het gaat weer nog leeg komen, want het zijn er juist bezig met rapportage. Ja, oké, ja, daar. Och, juist. Ja, ik ga René volledig zijn goesting laten doen hier. René was eigenlijk architect, hij was aannemer, hij was baas van de schrijnwerkers, hij was baas van de luchtgieters en van de metsers. Laten zeggen. Er is hier praktisch niets gebeurd die aan zijn ander ontsnapt is. Ja, hoe oud zou het dan geweest zijn? Kan ik je moeten rekenen, hè? Ik ben van 27. René is 2 jaar jonger als ik. En we zijn in 58 in het gebouw, dus reken zelf. René ging in feite vrij ver. Soms een beetje te ver, want als we dat hier gemonteerd hebben, ja, dan hebben we eigenlijk een beetje ons leven geriskeerd.
Ik denk, als je de foto's van de werf ziet, die toch wel zeer avontuurlijk zijn. Je ziet daar toch wel, vind ik, het plezier van samen te ontdekken tijdens de werf van hoe gaan we dat hier nu letterlijk recht houden. Dus een werf was echt een soort van klein laboratorium.
Vandaag bouwen wij ook in onze eigen praktijk voor zelfbouwers. Dat is een enorm interessant proces, omdat dat het idee van het wonen brengt op het idee van het koken. Het maakt dat wonen en bouwen en architectuur zoiets wordt als kledij. Iets dicht, een keuze.
Dat we zo hoog staan, is eigenlijk puur toeval. Want normaal gezien ging dat huis maar 70 centimeter boven de grond staan. Maar toeval wil, er stond hier een betonnen citern. Ik was er gaan opstaan, dan zat hij in één keer tot over te schelden. En ik dacht tegen René, ik moet in de nog geen probleem zijn dat we van deze keer een meter hoger gaan. En de meter kwam niet goed uit, dus hij heeft van deze keer op 2 meter gestaan ongeveer. Het resultaat was dus dat meneer veel beter zicht gaan hebben.
Wat ik echt toch wel geniaal vind aan die woning, is de soort van ongehoorzaamheid ervan. Dus de woning had een bouwaanvraag, was goedgekeurd, de werf begint. En tijdens de werf zien, vermoed ik, Gilbert en René samen dat die woning misschien toch iets te compact is voor een familie met 5 personen.
Oorspronkelijk ging die trap hier niet als de buitenkant staan, die ging van binnen staan. Dus we waren hier een groot stuk kwijt. Hè. Het was nog niet te goed om hier...
En dat is dus een bouwovertreding. Zeer bewuste bouwovertreding. Dus ook heel die woning is eigenlijk een heel grote fuck you aan het normatieve.
Als je een dossier kreeg bij stedenbouw, die mannen kwamen hier serieus bewonen in de raad nou dat we niets meer speuten. Hè. Want in feite hebben we dat huis zelf een meter of 5 verder achteruit gezet dan dat er op plan stond. Dus dat was ook niet koosbaar. Maar ja.
I could also just show the movie. The movie, unfortunately, is not yet available internationally, but we're working on it. But already you could see in the movie that the house is used in a very kind of daily basis, which is, I think, of course, also the beauty of it. And when the, let's say, well, it's a big word, but the construction site was finished, the first thing we advised to the client was to make sure that it got listed as a monument, which is, of course, a very strange thing to do because this house was conceived for maybe 20, 25 years, then demolished and have something else on site. But after 60 years, it was still there, and it was in maybe not a terrible condition. So we proposed to make it, let's say, to have it listed as a monument. Why? Then you no longer have to comply to rules like insulation or whatever. So to free up, in a way, the house. But secondly, also to make sure that heritage, so the service, the administration of heritage, they accepted the house as a monument. At the same time, they don't have any protocol to deal with this type of recent modern heritage. So we almost use it, and I also wrote it in the text, which is in the book we made on Heyvaert, as a Trojan house, not a horse, but a Trojan house. So we just infiltrated into the administration, and now it's sitting there. We're waiting. Maybe it will start to do something also extraordinary. Let's see. But the insubordinance of the house architecturally, I also think, has this quality vis-à-vis legislation and policy. And Heyvaert, of course, he didn't build that much during his life. So like I said, he practiced architecture more or less for 15 years. In those 15 years, maybe he built 10 houses. And this is one of the letters that we found in the archives. And of course, it's again in Dutch, or a type of Dutch. But as you can see, this is when he was already, when he left architecture a couple of years. But he reused one of his stationaries, like the office paper, and he mentions gefrustreerd. So René Heyvaert, frustrated architect. He was frustrated because he couldn't collaborate. He couldn't work with other people. He couldn't make any kind of compromise, which probably is intrinsical to architecture. And of course, the house for his brother, Gilbert, and his family was an uncompromised commission. Here you see one of the apartment buildings near Ghent. He built a lot of bungalows. I mean, out of those 10 or maybe 9 houses, most of them are bungalows. So very beautifully conceived and executed, very simple housing units. And again, each time in this logic of minimum of means, sometimes even going further than the Heyvaert House itself. But then in 1970, finally, he abandoned architecture. He had a very fragile consistency and health. He had a health condition, so he hardly could eat, so he was very fragile. And in 1970, he actually received kind of subvention, kind of handicapped subvention from the States, and he finally said, I'm free, and he became an artist. And since, so until 1984, his death, he practiced his art in an unrelentless way. And let's say the few buildings that he realized during his 15 years as an architect, as an artist, he produced an enormous amount of work. And this work, I'm not going into complete detail, but this work always had to do with daily life. Because he was so fragile, so he couldn't manipulate, I mean, he couldn't make any sculptures or big paintings or whatever. So he was linked, let's say, or limited to small scale, light objects. I mean, each time commenting on daily life. So this is a cross of pieces of bread, drawings. Very simple in unalit, very simple manipulations. These objects are just this size. You could almost call them a kind of simple approach, but with a very beautiful, again, economy of means, very precise, often incomprehensible. Each time one manipulation per time or per object. And of course, these things you have to see just as the architecture in real life. He also, for instance, had numerous cutlery pieces where he manipulated and destroyed them in a way because, like I said, he almost couldn't eat. Twice ciré, cut out. This was at the end of his life when he couldn't hardly manipulate things anymore. Weaving pieces, so the right object is a weaving piece. Or again, very small objects. Strange, he had beautiful drawings. Each time with inscriptions. Union match, the matchsticks, they come back each time in different formats. Reuse. So, I mean, we're now talking about, let's say, 1970 till 1984. So, of course, these works of art are also children of their time. They are related to certain influences, artistic influences. And at the same time, he manages, I think, just as he did, especially with the Heyvaert House, to coin a very specific DNA, a very fragile DNA that maybe you could call Belgian, maybe not, but somewhere in that region. It's kind of doing a lot with almost nothing. And the images I've shown you, the last couple of works, they all stem from this small booklet. This is, let's say, the next step. So when the house was finished, we started discussing with a museum in Belgium who had to do a show. So we had a big part of the artworks of Heyvaert, Museum M in Leuven. They had to do a show. And together with Eva Wittox, the co-curator, we proposed not to only show the artwork, but also to exhibit the architectural work of René Heyvaert. And independent of Heyvaert, personally, I think there's nothing more horrid than to exhibit an architecture, in the sense that it's impossible to exhibit architecture. But that's maybe something also for discussion afterwards. But nevertheless, we said, let's try in a museum context. So let's say from the lived experiment of the house, the artwork, now we're moving, let's say, slightly into a more maybe hygienic context, the one of the museum. And to imagine both Heyvaert's art and Heyvaert's architecture, which to me are very intimately linked, but we decided not to show them together. So they were shown in the museum in two separate spaces. And in between you had to do a whole parcours, so that you can, if you would go from architecture to art, you could forget the architecture, and vice versa, you could forget the art. And you could just focus on this one thing. And on the left you see the art room, on the right you see the architecture room. And the art room shows 150 works, which is, I think, the first time we were able to bring together so many works, because they're all, I mean, all over the place. So a couple of the works are in public collections, but most of them are in private collections and not listed. And for the architecture exhibition piece, we decided to show one work, i.e. the house of Heyvaert, of Gilbert Heyvaert and his family. And interestingly enough, the space we had at hand, which was a kind of double height space, the floor plan fitted perfectly for the house. So in that sense, the decision was quickly made to do a one-to-one model of the house. I'll first show you briefly some of the iterations for the artist. This is the installation, couple of model shots where we try to make something which again is extremely fragile and light, similar to the approach of Heyvaert. I'm not going to explain the concept, but you'll see some of the pictures of the space itself, where we hung pieces on bent perspex plates on steel structures, making each time new ensembles between the works, because that's also maybe interesting to mention is that none of the works of Heyvaert have a name, so they're all untitled. So imagine making a catalog, they're all untitled, and they don't come with a protocol. So we had to, in a way, invent on the spot, a bit like on construction site, what to do with the works, even how to put them. I mean, because some of them were completely unclear on how to be mounted. And through this almost maybe simple space, all of a sudden these new connections started to arise. And I must say that I was very glad that we got really, because again, exhibiting Heyvaert so far, he's been exhibited a couple of times in Belgium, each time in a very kind of serene, like one work on one wall way. So this was kind of potentially troublesome because we were putting a lot of things together visually, but it worked very well. Some of the cutlery. And we leave the space. And then we go to the next space, 50 meters on the other side. And there you enter the house, but of course you enter something else. You enter the structure of the house, which is literally, I mean, all the sections were repeated. This project, this part was done together with the University of Leuven, Arno Hendricks and Wim Goossens as professors, with their students, knowing that the original house of Heyvaert was also built with students. So in a way, kind of reiterating the idea of education, of school linked to architecture. And of course, it's a kind of denuded structure, so that it's not a house, it's a principle, which you can question. To me, at least, it felt completely different, let's say, there than the actual house. But all of a sudden, some of the also construction principles and some of the proportion principles became extremely clear. And we also installed a couple of elements. You see the curtains. You saw the curtains also in the house refabrication. These curtains were done with Chevalier Masson, Brussels textile designers. So for the duration of the exhibition, the curtains were taken out of the house and put in the exhibition, and a couple of other elements as well. And you see also, for instance, the elements of the bathroom coming back. So moments of the house without explaining the whole thing. There was also no explanation, so people could just walk in, glance. Some of the corrugated material was also present. And it was more about, again, testing the capacity of exhibiting. Because also Heyvaert in his own work, when he was exhibiting, this was always a test. If you, I'm not going to show you some of the older gallery shows of Heyvaert tonight, but you saw always this kind of work in process. It was never a final state, which I think is a really interesting condition. And also in the house, or let's say on the wall of the space where the house was built, we also showed another small movie, and please allow me. So this is a movie with, on the left, 12 detail shots, and on the right, 4 pan shots, zoomed out shots of the house. At the exhibition, there was also 2 models which were made during the residency of the Welderving-Tailleux. Their students made 2 versions of the house. The one on the left, let's say, in the 60s, early 70s, and the one on the right, the condition it had in 2014 before the last reconversion. And all of a sudden, this kind of almost mise en abîme of scales of having this house with the backdrop of the city, but also the way this whole thing, I mean, I think the models the students built were as experimental, let's say, as the house itself, as unstable also, because the stair always fell off during the exhibition. But at the same time, having this experience, even on a small scale, is rather similar. And again, in this house in the museum, or this structure in the museum, some of the remnants of the original house, but also, as I said earlier, seeing this infrastructure or even abusing the museum show as a school, an educational tool. This was during construction, going each time one step back. So making the whole thing when the structure arrived, the prefab structure. And this is a self-built package, which is the house. I think it's very, very enlightening also, because of course the house existed. So the first time when we saw this package arriving at the museum, this is but a house. So you can do, with such minimum means, you can make a house. And again, on the left you see 1958. On the right you see the same action or the similar action, 2018. As I said, both times students were involved in building the house. And of course we can be delighted about such details and say, oh, this is a fantastic architectural solution. But the thing to round up, which really interests me about the Heyvaert House, and why to talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes about one house, is that on the left you see this is the Heyvaert House, right? So it's not built in the city, it's not an urban condition, but I think it's a metropolitan condition in the sense that it's near a protected fields, it's near a productive landscape. On the right could be any city, but it's Luxembourg City, kind of dense urban fabric. And for me, Heyvaert, in that sense, the house Heyvaert is the maybe ideal counter project in today's discourse, where from a top-down level we are politically are demanded to live more in a more compact way, to live in the city, to insulate much more. And as I also said in the film, in a way the Heyvaert House is a big fuck you to the normative. And it's more about finding certain levels of freedom. Levels of freedom that very, very scarcely I see, to be honest, in architecture, or maybe that's, let's say, my doubt on architecture. So in that sense, I think it's maybe also an honor to have been able to spend 3 years with this very quirky yet precious house, with this quirky yet very precious family. And to me, it has proven the fact that I don't think we should all live in the city. I don't think we should all live in very small units. And if it's in very small units, it needs to have a fantastic outlook on the landscape. And I don't think we should insulate until we can't breathe anymore. That's for me the real value of the Heyvaert House. Thank you.